All right, again, good afternoon, everyone. I'm JT Dean with Chesapeake Conservancy. I want to welcome you all to our newest edition of Chesapeake Conservancy's webinar series. We're calling this Avian Icons of the Chesapeake. We began this webinar series last year to recognize our shared connection with our common home, in particular the Chesapeake Bay watershed, and celebrate the people and creatures that call this place home. For those of you who might not be familiar with Chesapeake Conservancy, our overarching goal is to conserve 30% of the Chesapeake Bay watershed by 2030. We work to accomplish this by using data science to identify the places we care about, determine why we should care about them, and how we should protect them. This data is used to empower policymakers and other like-minded organizations and even individual landowners on how we can be effective stewards of our lands. In addition, we work through various means and partnerships to protect the special places around the watershed that hold ecological, historical, and cultural value, ensuring they can be open to everyone as a way to connect everyone to the outdoors and inspire millions to be conservationists. It's our pleasure to offer this webinar today. I know for several years now, thousands and many of you have come to love the featured birds on our webcam, our blue herons, peregrine falcons, and ospreys. In fact, just yesterday, our peregrine falcon Barb laid her 4th egg, so we're all on egg watch right now here at the Conservancy. But we wanted to provide an opportunity for you all to get to know ways about how we can protect our birds, not just on our webcams, but nationwide, and other species that are vital to our ecological systems here. To learn more, we're honored to have with us our special guest, Dr. Antonio Solis Murillo, Chief of the U.S. Geological Survey Bird Banding Lab. He's been a biologist with the BLL at the USGS Patuxent Wildlife Research Center since 2017, and has been working with the BBL team to strengthen the data management system for bird banding data, support research projects that use banding data, and coordinate efforts in North America and the Western Hemisphere. Currently, as chief, he works with the BBL team and partners to ensure the lab remains the premier resource for long-term bird banding and marking data in North America. His main goal is to make sure that BBL becomes a robust, integrated scientific resource that rapidly adapts to new science studies, study methods, and technologies to facilitate successful and effective bird management and conservation science. He's also an affiliated researcher at the Illinois Natural History Survey and studies various aspects of avian ecology and behavior with an overarching goal of improving conservation efforts. His studies involve the study of birds under natural conditions and using traditional and novel technologies for the study of behaviors and for surveying animals. Both the Bird Banding Lab and Chesapeake Conservancy are using data to inform conservation policy and empowering us all to take an active role in environmental protection. Dr. Solis Murillo will be sharing more about how the Bird Banding Lab is doing this important work. Later on at the very end, we'll have a question and answer session, and you can begin to put your questions into the question and answer box right there, and we'll do our very best to get to as many as we possibly can in the time that's allotted for us. With that being said, it's my pleasure to welcome and pass things off to Dr. Solis Murillo. Sir.
Thank you, JT. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Okay. JT, can you see everything well?
Yep, I can see it.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, JT, for the invite. I have to say it's a pleasure for me to have the chance to talk with you. I really see that Chesapeake Conservancy is definitely doing a lot of great work, and we are neighbors. We are in Maryland here, and it's definitely I feel like it's very useful for me to see all what you are doing. It's just so diverse, the work that everybody is doing in Chesapeake Conservancy, and definitely I check the camps once in a while. I'm kind of looking forward to see more camps all over. And as JT said, I'm the chief of the Bird Banding Lab, and today the title of my talk is A Century Supporting and Advancing Management and Conservation Science. And for those who are not familiar with bird banding, It's very simple, very simple. The work that we do is really relies on a technique that is used to study birds. Bird banding is simply the attachment of a little mark, a little band, aluminum band in most cases, very small band that is attached to a leg of a bird, a live bird. We release the bird and we hope to find that bird again. And that band has a unique number that allows us identification of the individual, and having that information of when we capture the bird, we put the band with a unique number, we release the bird. We hope that that bird is going to be found sometime in the future, whether it is live or dead or resighted, hoping that it's going to be found again. And having those 2 points of information, the banding and the encounter, we call the encounters, or the reports of those birds, having those point informations allow the scientists to actually track behavior. I mean, we know where the bird was banded and where the bird ended. We can study bird migration with that. Over time, we know that that bird was captured multiple times through several years. So among all these band reports that we have for all these species, we can estimate the lifespan of the birds. We can use the tracking to study bird populations. Knowing those individuals and the recaptures, we can estimate how many birds are there and how much they are surviving. We can understand their survival, their behavior, and even we can be very clever at using that information, those 2 pieces of information, to not just track the migration of birds, but also track diseases and even assess contaminants in the environment. So overall, banding is really assisting in the management and conservation, and it's proven definitely to be an important for bird monitoring and for the protection and recovery of birds that are endangered or threatened. The Bird Banding Lab was established in 1920, and it was specifically established to support the collection, archiving, management, and dissemination of the banded birds, of the bird banding data and banded birds. A lot of people asks like how in 1920 we really establishing the Bird Banding Lab, and in really the story of the Bird Banding Lab, I think it's great nowadays when we think how in 1920 we were planning this type of research. There's a picture here in this slide about Frederick Lincoln. He was the first chief of the Bird Banding Lab, and he was really the first supporter in the early 1900s about having a lab, a unified system to do bird banding. And really the need of the Bird Banding Lab came from, I mean, the conversations about the Bird Banding Lab really started in the late 1800s, early 1900s, when they realized, scientists realized that bird populations were in trouble. They immediately look at the situation that there were 0 regulations at that time. So we were basically hunting unlimited number of birds. So it was definitely an eye-opening for many people in the early 1900s, specifically about the regulations. And we had many cases in the early part of the 19th century that, for instance, the passenger pigeon, I found this painting of the passenger pigeon that depicts how abundant was this bird in the 1800s. For those who are not familiar with this bird, this was an endemic bird in North America. It was very common. Even estimates are that there were at least 6 billion birds moving and roaming North America in the 1800s. This bird was extinct at the early 1900s, and the last passenger pigeon died in September 1st in 1914. But cases like these basically were very crucial for all the scientists to understand that unregulated hunting and take in general of birds was not good for the bird populations. So finally, in 1918, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act was enacted. And this act prohibited the hunting, killing, and capturing, possessing, and anything that really was considered as take for birds and feathers, eggs, and anything. So definitely this act was really what brought attention for the need to have a unified system, a unified program within the federal system that was able to provide federal permits, authorize who was able to take and how much to take, and develop a banding system to being able to track bird populations. So really, that's how the bird banding came out. There were two scientists that I like to mention in my talks, Paul Barch and Leon Cole. These two scientists were really visionaries. They were 1900. They were already banding birds and trying different things to study birds migration, bird populations. Paul Barch was actually in Washington, D.C., banding black crown-eyed herons with the Smithsonian. And he was definitely one of the critical scientists who was pushing hard to develop this system. Leon Cole was a scientist who was more focusing on studying the bird populations. He was a statistician. But the interesting part of these two scientists is that they suggested that we needed a system that was long-term, that was large scale, and that worked in a very systematic fashion because they were envisioning large ecological crises in the future. So I think that's the visionary part, that they were really thinking ahead of their time, knowing that we needed to have a national resource that needed to collect data in a systematic fashion to being able to do large and continental projects for the study of birds and being able to address ecological crisis. So that, to me, I think it's something very interesting, how people in 1900s, they were actually envisioning what is happening today in terms of the ecological issues. Let me see here, the chat here. Yes, okay. So something that, so, it's not changing. Hold on. Here you go. So yeah, that's basically how the National Bird Banding Lab was established in 1920. It was really well justified at the beginning, and 103 years later, we are still here. Today, we are not just an operational program, we are an integrated scientific program, because not just federal permitting is our responsibility, we also manage the data, try to analyze the data that we collect, and help and collaborate with many, many partners across the continent to advance not just bird banding science, but support the management and conservation science. This is a picture of our center, our program. We are in Laurel, Maryland, so we are neighbors. We are here very close to all of you, and we have a great place. We are at the Patuxent Research Refuge. Overall, the Bird Banding Lab, what it does is, in addition to the permitting, we have components within our lab. We are a large team. So we have a scientific component, educational component. We have a lot of international participation. Think about birds, especially migratory birds, they don't have borders. So they go across the continent, migrating every year. So we need to have some international component in our program. We have an analytical capacity, which is basically people trying to dive into the large amount of data we collect and analyze that data to work with collaborators. And of course, we have a very important community science component too in our lab. We have multiple applications that we use to connect with our audiences. Our community is really the federal and agency scientists, and we do a lot of work with the vocational banders and public. Vocational banders for us are people who is qualified, well-trained, work with birds, but they are only doing it in a citizen science program and trying to contribute to the lab, but they probably are not professionals or they don't live out of the bird banding activities, and the public, of course. So those applications that we have there showing, the first one is the permit application that we use to connect with the people. Whoever needs a permit, it comes to us, and we based on following some requirements, we give the permits, the federal permits to the people to capture birds and mark birds. We also use the Bander portal, which is an application that allows us to manage the data that we receive. And the last one, which is the one that it's more important for me to mention in this talk, is the application. It's called reportband.gov, which is where we receive report from the public about banded birds. And I'm going to tell more about it after this. So today, the Bird Banding Lab, after 103 years, we have 9,000, a little bit more than 9,000 permitted banders across the US. They all go out, they have federal permits, they go out, collect, capture birds, mark birds, release those birds, and they keep doing it all year round for very specific scientific projects or large collaborative projects happening in the US for conservation and management of birds. Today we have more than 80 million banding records. We have more than 5 million encounters, those reports of those banded birds. And both bandings and encounters annually are increasing a lot more, which is a really good indicative that the people out there is more and more engaged with birds, and they are willing to put more time on citizen science programs, either reporting more birds to us or scientists doing more work on the banding in the field. So, like I said, the main responsibility is the federal permitting. And the only thing I want to point out in this slide is that we are the program that give the bands for free to all the scientists, with the condition that once they use those bands in the field, capture birds, put the bands, release the birds, all the data that they collect, they send it to us. So we are the large repository of everybody's projects here in the Bird Banding Lab. And we authorize also color bands, auxiliary markers, all kinds of neck colors for some birds, flags, color-coded bands, plastic color bands for, different species may use very different colors or different types of marks with codes. We authorize all those too. Yeah, we have a platform to manage all the banders' data. It's really not too relevant here, but this is the one that we have, this application, reportband.gov. This is the one that really works very well for us because we have all the public, pretty much all the world reports into this platform. Every time people finds a bird, live or dead, or has a picture with a band and it has a number or a code, they come to reportband.gov and they report the band to us. And our work is to receive that information, immediately let know the banders who do that, and keep curating and storing all that data in our databases to being able to package that information to do specific projects. Our data is, because it's the federal government, our data is free of charge. Everybody can use it. And we have multiple ways of accessing our data. They can come to us and request anything related to our data, and we can give it to everyone. And that's how many students from universities, non-governmental organizations doing projects related to birds, or someone who is interested on specific species in certain regions, they can come to us and we can give all the data for them so they can do their studies. So overall, we work with many, many collaborators. Once our data in our archive is all clean and ready to be shared, we work with many, many hundreds of organizations who use our data to do their science and addressing specific biological or ecological issues related to birds. And I have a few examples here to share with you. For instance, there are coordinated groups of citizen science, or we call avocational banders, who work in bird observatories across the country, or work with coordinated groups to address specific questions. For instance, we have in the image here, we have a MAPS program. The Institute for Bird Populations developed a program many years ago, since 1989, where he was asking for people with qualifications and permits to go and collect data so they could understand how many birds are nesting, how many babies are fledging, and through banding, try to estimate the production of those populations and the survival of those populations. And they work in coordination with thousands of people. This organization has close to 1,500 banding stations distributed across the country. That's the map there. And together they collect all the data as a yearly basis, and they have a specific way to analyze the data to inform what's the production and survival of those species that they're studying. Just like that, we have multiple coordinated groups who do this type of work. There are some that are focused on owls, some of them are focused on raptors, some of them are focused on hummingbirds, and others in specific ecological issues, or even different taxa like migration monitoring network focuses on only birds that migrate during the spring and the fall across the country. But interestingly, these groups are the ones who are doing science in our country, and it's really, they are the leaders of conservation. Just to give you an idea of how our work of bird banding is distributed across the country, this is a recent map that I got from our data. We have more than 150,000 banding locations. These are historical. Not all of them are active, and not all of them are separate banders. Some banders have like dozens of locations where they are banding throughout the year. But this is just gives you an idea how the bird banding technique and how our efforts, coordinated efforts, are collecting data throughout the continent, mostly in the country, Canada and United States, in a very coordinated fashion to use this data to do the biology that we do in ecology. This is a map of the encounters of the birds. These are all the reports that we are gathering. So far we have more than 5 million reports, and lately we've seen a huge increase of reports from banded birds from the public, mostly because nowadays it's very popular for people who goes to parks or goes to protected areas, or even in the wild. They just go with cameras and spotting scopes, and they take pictures, and they take a lot of pictures or videos, or have the ability to find birds with bands, and they are the ones who take enough pictures to send it to us and report those birds. So we don't only getting the recaptures from the birds that are banded by scientists, we also get a lot of resightings from the people. And we've seen in the last few years that more and more people is learning about birds banded, and they love to be reciting birds and report it to us. So if one day you see a bird out there with a band and you can see the numbers, you can go to reportband.gov and send those information to us. So how do we use the data? I mean, a lot of people also questions why we are collecting all this data and making all this effort for 100 years of collecting the data. Well, there are really many successful stories that we have on how our data is being used. I will say the most successful case that I see is the Adaptive Harvest Management Program. This is a program that started in 1950s, focusing on waterfowl population. Waterfowl populations were very important to manage and protect, particularly because they are hunted species. So federal state agencies in the 1950s got together. By that time, 1950, they knew enough about bird migration, so they were able to separate the North America by flyways. So we have the Pacific flyway, the Central Flyway, Mississippi Flyway, and Atlantic Flyway. And they separated all those flyways by efforts from different states. And those states that fell within those flyways worked together to do a mandate of a certain amount of banded birds that they had to do accomplish every year, with the goal that those birds, after being hunted, they are reported. So there was a concerted effort between scientists going to do banding birds in the field and training and working in collaboration with hunters, that every time they hunt, if they find a bird, they needed to report. And over 70 years, it's been happening that, and really allows scientists to understand bird populations, knowing how many birds are hunted every year and how many birds are being banded every year, is how they come up with the idea about the status of the population. But that information is ultimately used to inform how the hunting regulations of the following years will happen. So it really brings recommendations on matters of migratory bird conservation, and has a great impact on harvest and management. So what they do basically is that all the states have the concerted effort to go out, band birds. Sometimes they connect that banded data with other surveys like aerial surveys and other different monitoring techniques. And together they model that data every year, and they know specifically what's the status of the population for every species, and then give specific recommendations to the federal government on how the hunting regulations will happen the next year. After 70 years, hunters follow those recommendations very, in a very strict manner, and they allows creating basically a connection between the scientists and the community, and ensure that everybody is happy with what they do. Hunters can continue hunting, but with very strict limits and regulations, and scientists keep following the data and tracking the data over the populations over time, and ensure that the population is healthy. This is a good example of this program, how this is a picture, a graph of the North American bird populations nowadays, where we see that a lot of bird populations are crashing, except the waterfowl populations who are managed properly, and they've been managed for 70 years. So overall, we see that the scenario of hunting it's very good in the case when it's managed properly. And of course, this project, as successful it is in part because of the bird banding science that is happening behind. Other projects like this, I mean, I can talk about dozens of projects like these where bird banding behind the scenes brings the support for the science that needs to happen. This is another one that is very common. You probably are familiar with this, the Whooping Crane Restoration Program. This is a program that happened within the federal government for 50 years. And this program started because in 1941, we realized that there were only 21 birds in the wild. And I think there were 2 birds in captive. And we basically put together a task force to rescue the bird. And in this task force, of course, the Bird Banding Lab was a key piece, because we needed to find a way to identify all the individuals. This was a captive program, so there was a lot of work happening in Patuxent Reserve Refuge with captive birds. But basically, it was very successful. Nowadays, the program ended because the birds are somewhat healthy. I think there are about between 800 to 1,000 birds in the wild now. And it was basically rescuing the population specifically. And bird banding, again, behind the scenes, was playing a critical role in this conservation issue. I think I don't know if you're familiar with this program. It was a very cool program where they had captive birds, and everyone who needed to take care of the birds needed to wear like suits, like crane suits. And once the babies were out, birds were trained with airplanes and how to fly through to the south during the migration route, basically bringing the babies from captive to the wild. It was a great, neat project. And again, banding data and reports of the birds later on have been helping to keep track of those populations. So those birds still out there, they're reproducing in the wild now. They are banded in the wild. People continues banding them, and they hope for people to keep reporting those birds so we can continue tracking the population of that bird and see what's the fate of the population. With our large amount of data that we're collecting, of course, we are putting all that as a whole, and we are collaborating with many people. This is a graph that shows two projects that are focusing on, the first one is the Smithsonian group, where they are developing an atlas of migratory connectivity using the banding and encounter data. They are trying to estimate what is the connectivity between the northern sites and the south sides during the migration. And one of the main goals for them is to identify where are the wintering grounds for them, so they can inform conservation, where are the important sites to conserve, just to prioritize basically the conservation. And then the right side, we have a project that we have in collaboration with National Audubon Society, where they are integrating multiple data types, including the bird banding and encounter data, with tracking data and eBird data and many more data sets that they are trying to put together for the whole continent as a way to also understand how the birds are migrating, where they are going, and which are the priority sites to conserve. One of the things about this application from National Audubon that is using our data is that the fact that are connecting with all the other data types, so it's not just banding data, it's tracking data and other things. It really brings a totally new perspective of how migration is happening, where are the birds going, and it's identifying what are the important sites to conserve. It's a pretty cool. You should check out this platform. It's called Migration Explorer from the National Audubon Society. You can go there and you can look for every species in North America, and it will show you how they are migrating and all the data combined. The interesting part of this, it has multiple options. It's not just about the migration and tracking, but also about the species connectivity. So you can go and plot all the bird banding data we have. You can select the species, and it will show you how one point in space is connected with another point. So yeah, check out this application. And well, after talking a lot about the data and about what the Bird Banding Lab, one of the I think is very important to reconsider where are we today. After 103 years of collecting data and doing great science, we still see that today what is changing is that we are truly finding out with our data that we are in trouble, and we have really a lot of ecological issues happening. This is an image from a report that just came out a few years ago from Cornell, and it's talking about identifying that 3 billion birds have gone since the 1970s. Definitely, there are a lot of reports out there that are using our data and are looking at as a whole all the birds and trying to understand where are we today. There's another report from Audubon that says 2/3 of North American birds are increasing risk of extinction from global temperature rise. Definitely, we are at the moment where we are very evident ecological crisis, and is making us think a lot more about what are the components where we need to focus in addition to the science. And because of our thinking now and seeing all what is happening after 100 years, despite doing great work in the field doing our science, we notice that definitely one key element of our work is to get involved in the community science more and more. So basically, we're putting a lot of emphasis in continuing our nationwide constituency of conservation supporters. We know that bird banding is a great technique to be in the field to collect data, but also to engage with the community. We know banding stations also serve as outdoor classrooms to enhance the public appreciation of birds and their habitats. So we're putting a lot of efforts to connect with the people, and through hundreds, if not thousands, of banding stations that are out there, we encourage everyone to attend those banding stations and learn more about the birds and engage more with supporting bird banding and bird conservation. One of the things that I always like to see when we are banding is that having a bird in the hand is always it's always amazing for everyone. I was commenting, I was talking with someone that every time I take a picture of someone grabbing a bird, there's always a smile on them. So I always say that so like our currency in the bird banding world is the joy of birds, because once you start getting close to the birds, and maybe even having a bird in your hand, you just immediately get engaged with the birds. It's very important. So we are focusing a lot now on engaging with the community and take an approach of bringing the community closer and closer to us. And we know that we are not the only ones. We know that many agencies and across the country, we been seeing that there's an increase of the community scientists really getting engaged, basically community being more interested in nature conservation and getting more engaged. There's this a report, it's a little bit old report a few years back, that basically Americans are just engaging more and more in conservation. And I think there's a lot of room for them to help us and support conservation in the monitoring practices, but also in any other participation like is happening. For instance, this is one bird that was banded in 2012. It has a code 2TK, and it's coming from Canada, and it's flying always every year to Punta del Este in Uruguay. And this bird goes back every year from the north to the south to the same spot in a peninsula in Punta del Este in Uruguay. And this bird is being recited every year. So people, little by little, going to this place and knowing more about this, start making like a big deal about it, writing about it. They go to see the bird, and people just one bird is engaging a whole community. They even make festivals for the bird when the bird arrives. The bird, everybody is kind of waiting, and there are chats talking about like, oh, 2TK hasn't been here, and they are waiting for it until finally the bird arrives, and everybody, you see in the news that 2TK is already in Uruguay again. And it's just an example. I'm putting this just an example of how just one bird, one banded bird, is engaging a whole community. And I think that is a great path for us for improving our conservation efforts. A little bit of similar to this is the another banded bird, which is the wisdom. You probably heard about wisdom. Wisdom was it's an albatross in the Pacific Island that was banded 73 years ago. And this bird keeps showing up. Is the oldest wild bird known, keeps returning to the same island, and everybody is waiting for this bird. Now this bird has multiple generations, and even their grandsons and sons or daughters are being recited, and everybody keeps track of these birds, and it's a perfect way to engage the community. So like this approach, there are many more approaches. It's not just about bird banding. There's another very similar situation that is happening with webcams. Webcams have proven to be a good way to engage the community, and we are all having fun basically using webcams. This is
Yeah, well, first, I just want to make note, you're talking about the folks that are involved in setting these webcams, and I just want to recognize our volunteers who are hosting these webcams. Several of them are on the call today, who put in a lot of work to cultivate these birds and these cameras. This community is part of their family, and so I just want to publicly thank them for their efforts. But going along with your comments about these being a biological indicator, and seeing, well, you showed the graph before, the increase of wild waterfowl, birds of prey in the communities, and especially the increase around the Chesapeake Bay area. What do you attribute to the success and the rise in the populations, and how can we continue to be more vigilant within the Chesapeake Bay watershed as it applies to the populations of the birds specifically on the webcams or just general birds of prey that rely so heavily on the Chesapeake?
Well, I think one of the things that I feel that is very important in these cases is that the webcams are focusing on raptors. One of the things that they are like on top of, the raptors are generally on top of the food chain. So when I said biological indicators, is literally because they are telling us what's happening all the way down to the food chain, whether it's fish populations, health of the waters, health of the mainland, vegetation, how our restored areas are working. Really is a good way. Monitoring and tracking raptors specifically is definitely key, because we have a sense of every type of environmental issue we have. So I definitely see that putting efforts on keeping track of our populations and see if in fact they're going up or down is just the key that I know it seems like it's like a slow, you don't get a quick result right away, but I think just tracking the populations, even with webcams, is how you are going to notice those differences that are happening over time in terms of bird populations, which reflect on what's happening in the bay or in the areas where you are. So I think it's there are many advantages. It's not just about tracking the populations. It's also about make the population or the people aware of what's happening. So I think it's a great way of connecting with the people and teach them, or by themselves will learn how things are changing in our environment.
Obviously it's not enough to just increase the population of these species. We have to maintain them. Are there any troubling indicators that you've been seeing regarding birds, particularly in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, that we should be aware of? Things that your lab is closely monitoring?
Well, our lab specifically hasn't been monitoring much, but our center where we work, the Eastern Ecological Science Center, definitely plays a role. We have a lot of we have toxicologists, for instance, that they are studying raptors. We actually have in our facility several like a little bit more than 100 pairs of raptors specifically to study pollutants in the environment, and which pollutants in the environment really reflect how the ecological process sometimes is broken, right? In this case, for instance, this is an example of the menhaden that basically is key for the health of the waters and other species. And I think what we see is just tracking the populations for us informs us that there's something wrong, and work in collaboration with all the other groups that focus on very specific things, whether it is toxicology, whether it is fish, whether it is habitat or whatever. We work with them in collaboration, and together is how we have a concerted perspective of what's happening. So we really stay more on the tracking of the bird populations over time. So that's so we have so that's probably not a specific answer, but we see definitely that our role stays within the populations only.
That's great. Well, I have a bunch of other questions, but I want to open up to our audience here. I know we have several already in the Q&A box here that I want to get to. So if anyone else has any additional questions, please feel free to put them in. Just to start off here, are there any bird banders in the area, around the watershed that host events that public can participate in or at least observe?
Yes, they are banders, and I'm happy to provide a list of all the locations that we have. I know we have many MAPS stations. MAPS are those monitoring avian productivity survival stations that happen spring, summer. But I know there are also stations in the fall for both passerines and raptors. So I'm happy to give information about all the banding stations that are within the watershed.
Yeah, that'd be great. I'd be happy to pass it along to our audience.
Yeah, that will be easy. And then this way you can, everyone can just see what's closer to you, and then you can go. But definitely I recommend to go to one of those.
And a question here that we got, I guess if you're looking at the news, there was a rare bird, I believe it was a loon, that found itself in the Bellagio Hotel in Vegas. Are you aware of that? When something like that happens, does the bird get banded or tracked? Like what happens with that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in this case, I think that bird was not banded, as I recall. There are different. I guess it's case by case. In some cases, the bird is banded, and sometimes there are researchers nearby, or luckily it happens to be a research center nearby, and that's still within the area of their study, and they have the chance to band it. But not all the cases. Sometimes for just one bird, they don't specifically go to band the bird. But we have cases where the birds have been banded and they end in places like this, and they are being tracked over time with cameras. So it's a matter of, it's a case by case. I don't think this one will be banded, but I haven't heard lately if people nearby is studying birds and there's an opportunity to do it. Yeah.
And going back to the beginning of your presentation, the passenger pigeon, why did it go extinct in 1914?
Well, they assumed that the first driver was unlimited, zero regulations and hunted basically. They are pictures of piles and piles of those pigeons.
Wow.
So there's probably just extreme practice of banding, and that's why those cases were critical for setting up the Migratory Bird Treaty Act and stop this type of hunting. So yeah, they say that there are now more ideas that there's probably some diseases, but because they say like how come, but we've seen this in multiple species, not just birds, but other species too, that unregulated hunting can get to that point.
Okay. Next question here is, given the advances in miniaturization and electronics, how is that being used as it applies to bird banding or for tracking these species?
That's a really good question. Yeah, and if you think about it, we initiated bird banding in 1920 with the idea to track bird migration, basically where the birds are going. But nowadays we have radios that can fit even into hummingbirds that can allow you to track those birds.
Wow.
And it's great. It's great information. And there's the perception like, oh, this is the new method. However, one of the differences that we've been finding is that, yes, it allows you to understand very detailed the movements of those birds, and it's perfect. However, when we think about the population level, this is a technique that is a little bit more trouble to use. It's expensive, the technique. So for instance, banding one bird, a band, it costs 0.03 cents or something like that. So banders can have millions of birds banded, and then you can address questions at the population level. While the tracking devices allows you to specifically answer questions of where the birds are going, but not information about where the population is going. So the key part right now is to have the bird banding as a foundation practice, because we can band millions of birds, and use the radio telemetry in coordination with the banded birds to answer specific questions like where are they going, or are they passing through Colombia, or how far they go, or how quick they get to the other place. So it's a combination of both, and it helps to address specific questions, but bird banding plays a main role. And actually, every bird that is being tracked with a device needs to have also an aluminum band, because it's the only permanent mark on the bird until the bird dies. While the radio transmitter may last only 3 months or 6 months or maybe a year, depending on the battery or the size of the radio. Like for a hummingbird, it can only last for like 7 days, the battery, or things like that. So yeah, the miniaturization has been helping to answer very specific questions, but it works in concert with the bird banding method.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. So I know a lot of us have, or at least an incredible recovery story has been the bald eagle in the United States, in particular in this area. I know myself included, and many others will randomly see a bald eagle around we didn't expect one to, and it's just one of the coolest experiences. So I wanted to ask you, and certainly from a question that we received here, is what is kind of the system around banding bald eagles? Is it occurring? How does it done? And how can people get more information on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, pretty much we are at the expense of the scientists and programs who focus on the species for the banding, right? So yeah, there's people banding birds everywhere. And there probably are specific projects in certain regions of the country where they see that there is an issue with the populations. And there are going to be other parts where no one is banding them because they feel like there's not a need. So it varies through time and through the landscape. how the banding happens ultimately especially for eagles or for every species, in fact. So really, I don't think I'm not aware of banding efforts nearby for bald eagles, but there are some areas where they see, and that's what we see when we look at our long-term data set. You see how banding efforts emerge for certain decades or days or years because there's a focused effort on doing it to answer specific questions. But so far, we've been fine with the species for now. So there's not a concerted effort across the country for that species.
Got it. Oh, thank you. All right, well, we're almost at the top of the hour, so we're going to wrap up here. But again, Dr. Solis Murillo, I just want to thank you so much for your time. This is incredibly informative, and I hope our audience got a lot out of it. I know I did. If anyone would like to learn more about Chesapeake Conservancy's work or the birds in our webcam, please feel free to visit our website at chesapeakeconservancy.org. I'll be also emailing out resources along with a copy of this webinar for you to review afterwards. And if you want to look at the other webinars we've had in the past, you can visit our YouTube channel. I'd also like to thank our sponsor for our 2024 webinar series, Truant, to help with companies' IT solutions. Our next webinar we're working on scheduling right now. It'll likely be later in the spring and around the first week of June. And we're hoping that we can discuss how native plants are being used to prevent runoff in our waterways and how our team in Pennsylvania is working to improve stream water quality in the Susquehanna River Valley. So please stay tuned for future events like hikes and other volunteer opportunities, and even a run across the Chesapeake Bay Bridge. But don't hesitate to let us know what other topics you want to hear from in future webinars and programming you want to see from Chesapeake Conservancy. So I hope you also, in addition, consider a contribution through Chesapeake Conservancy to ensure that Chesapeake Bay watershed remains protected, open, bountiful, and beautiful for generations to come. Now, we're all part of this effort together, and I'm so glad that you're on our team with us and you're joining to have an active participation in conservation efforts throughout the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you next time. Take care.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.